So I'm just going to ask first and foremost for an immense amount of grace, because my notes are really based on the pictures you're supposed to be seeing, the graphics, the charts you're supposed to be seeing behind me. So I'm going to slow down a bit, talk through what you would be seeing, talk through my notes, but try to reserve lots of time at the end for questions, which now might be about clarity about what I just talked about since we don't have the picture. But thank you all for inviting me today and for taking the time to listen. What I will start with is that first and foremost, the story of opportunity in Louisiana is immense, and it is a story that many of us have not told in quite some time. So if you don't know, the department was created in 1936 in state law with the mission of cultivating jobs and economic opportunity for the people of Louisiana. And that's pretty straightforward, right? But what's not straightforward is, what does that mean? How do we measure it? How do people feel it? How do people report it? How do people talk about the importance of it? And so some of that is what our department is working on, changing the way the more institutional behavior of economic development has happened in the past versus how we want to do it moving forward. So what I wanted to talk to y'all about today, again in lots of graphs and pictures, is what that looks like and how we're going to do it. So first and foremost, accomplishing the mission. On this wonderful slide, you would have seen a map of Louisiana, and I really am going to do that because I do feel like I have to put it in context. You would have seen a map of Louisiana broken up into 8 regions. And so at economic development here in the state, we have 8 economic development regions, each that has an organization that is the regional, it's state government, so we're all acronyms. We call them REDOs, Regional Economic Development Organization. We have 8 REDOs in Louisiana, and LED has in the past had sort of a formal but informal relationship with those 8 REDOs. The one in Baton Rouge obviously is BRAC, New Orleans is GNO Inc., and throughout the state, the entire state is covered through those 8. So the first thing that we are now looking at through the lens of the new economic development, the new LED, is that I just fundamentally believe, as does Governor Landry, that all economic development really is much like politics. It's local, right? It starts at the local level. It needs to start at the local level because first and foremost, your cities, your towns, your parishes better than Baton Rouge does. Forgive, when I say Baton Rouge for these purposes, I mean the capital, right? I don't mean the city right now. And you know the politics, you know the communities, you know the agendas in the communities, you know what's important to the community. So all economic development to be done successfully, first and foremost, has to start locally. So the department has shifted our attitude and our relationship with these 8 regional economic development organizations to have them drive more of the agenda rather than react when we engage them. So that's the first really important piece. The other piece of this great slide is this great graphic of lots of different government entities, because successful economic development has to be a whole of government approach. As I jokingly say oftentimes, if Commissioner Temple can just solve those problems, and Secretary Nelson can just solve those problems, and Superintendent Brumley can just solve those problems, my job's going to be a lot easier, right? And so it's sort of flip, but it's also honest, right? This has to be a whole of government approach. And one thing that this administration and our department has already undertaken is formalizing the way that we do that. Everything from our work with our federal delegation in Washington, to our local governments, to our cabinet agencies, to the legislature and beyond. There is a whole of government approach to our work at LED now. Hang on, just have to rebalance. And so if you accept that economic development is a whole of government approach, one also has to accept that the message of Louisiana, and I talk a lot about this now in my 7 months on the job, the message of the narrative of Louisiana has to be an all of Louisiana approach, right? That's not just a government approach. And in fact, the very people in this room have a tremendous opportunity and I would hope responsibility to participate with us in that work. So historically, I sort of describe it as the hand-wringing woe is me or woe is us mentality that many of us in Louisiana have accepted as our truth. And I would argue that it's not our truth, and that we are the loudest amplifiers of something that is in fact a misspoken narrative, right? So the old narrative is that Louisiana's economy is losing, we are not as successful as other states, and the new narrative that our department and hopefully many, many, many others and beyond is that we are positioning the Louisiana economy to win. And on this great slide behind me, you'd see this wonderful real-life example of a chart, okay? And I'm going to just walk you through it, so forgive me. And it was the data on U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So it was the data on Louisiana jobs by sector since 2020, so post-COVID, right? We had a negative 8% in tourism and hospitality, a negative 4% in government. Those two categories are red. That's where we lost jobs. Every other sector I'm about to read to you had growth, some as high as 44%. And those were manufacturing, professional and business services, private education, healthcare services, science and technology, and heavy and civil engineering and construction. All of those sectors I just said had growth, some as high as 44%. The headline on the article about that data says, Louisiana still hasn't recovered the jobs lost during the pandemic. So when I talk about us changing the narrative, the fact is in that in many, many, many respects, the facts are pretty good, right? They really are. And we as Louisianians don't always do ourselves many favors with telling the story that way. And so an entire focus of our department, among many, many other things, is changing that narrative. Because at the end of the day, you know, I got my start in politics a long time ago. But there's sort of, in campaigns 101, you define yourself before your opponent defines you for you, right? I feel like Louisiana has fallen into that conundrum in that we continue to let our detractors, whoever those may be, right? They could be other states competing for business. They could be specific agendas. But at the end of the day, I believe that we continue to let others define us and that we have to own our narrative and we have to own responsibility for telling the story differently. And so while I challenge all of you in the room to help with that, truth be told, we at LED have to take a primary role in that. We have to change that narrative. And I also believe if you really look at the statistic that we're all very used to wrapping our heads around and then wringing our hands around, you know, about this perception that our children have to leave to go find economic opportunity elsewhere, right? I would argue that number one, that's not true, and you'll hear more about some information as I walk through this presentation. But number two, there's no other state agency better positioned to try to change that narrative and more responsible, frankly, for changing that perspective than ours. At the end of the day, there are two state agencies with large marketing budgets. You know what they are? Ours and tourism, right? So the Lieutenant Governor has a significant budget to promote and market the state, and LED has a significant budget to promote and market the state. You know, the biggest challenge with that is the very message that the Lieutenant Governor does a great job of selling, that we're fun, we're easy, we're laissez-faire, right? We like to have a good time, is the very message I have to spend state resources trying to counter oftentimes. Because at the end of the day, we want to and need to be taken seriously as a place to locate your business, expand your business, and invest your resources in Louisiana. The great news is that the Lieutenant Governor and I have already begun conversations about, while we believe we'll never have the exact message, right? We have two very different audiences. If we align the messages, it's going to be far better for both of us. So let's talk a little bit about the actual details that have gone into some of our restructure work. So when Governor Landry appointed me, he appointed me under the expectation that, and it was really the primary driver for me being willing to and being excited about the role, but it was under the expectation that the outcomes Louisiana had seen in many respects were not acceptable, and that LED had a tremendous role in changing those outcomes, and so if we wanted to do things differently, then we had to do things differently. And that was going to involve blowing up some systems and changing some structures. So since before I even started, research was underway looking at other states and their best practices, the states that are quote, besting us in economic development, right? The ones that have reputations for winning. So the Committee of 100 started doing research as to what those states were and what were the common threads that they had in their economic development efforts that perhaps Louisiana didn't have or should try to emulate, try to replicate, and try to combine into our efforts. And so sort of what I did from there, because I like to boil things down to the most simple form, is I said, what are we trying to solve for? Before we come up with a solution, can someone please help me understand what are we trying to solve for, right? And I'll tell you, here are the things we were trying to solve for. Successful states have private sector guidance, vision, and leadership involved in their economic development efforts, right? They don't just have government bureaucrats setting the course for what economic development should be and how job creation should be handled. They have the private sector, the very leaders who are the job creators in their states, participating in the work itself, okay? So that was one piece that successful states had. The second piece that successful states had was a long-term strategic plan and strategic vision for what successful economic development for their state looked like. Louisiana hasn't had a strategic plan for economic development in 16 years. So, and it was great back then. It was done under the Moray years when Stephen Moray was Secretary of Economic Development under Governor Jindal. McKinsey did the plan. It was called Blue Oceans. It was incredibly aspirational, lots of value to it. And our department has been working off of that plan, and I say that loosely, for 16 years. So we knew we had to solve for that. And then there was this one other piece that sounds boring but important, is how I like to describe it. And that is successful economic development agencies across the country, the states that are winning, the staff of the people who are administering the work of economic development are not tied down to bureaucratic regulation that slows things down. They have the ability to respond at the speed of business. And so those were the things we were trying to solve for, right? So that became real simple when we realized what we were trying to solve for. So here is what Senate Bill 494, which became Act number 590 of this past legislative session, which we referred to as the Positioning Louisiana to Win bill. And we continue to use that moniker today. Here are the things that it did. Number one was it created the Louisiana Economic Development Partnership Board, which is a board of 11 appointments, 9 of whom are appointed by the governor, 1 by the president of the Senate, 1 by the Speaker of the House, and they are private sector individuals who have business experience, business leadership experience in Louisiana, who have invested capital, who know how they succeeded, who know what the barriers to their success were. And that board, the governor is actually finalizing those appointments, and we expect that announcement to be made hopefully by Friday of this week, absolutely no later than next week. And that board will meet and get about the work. Their primary responsibility is much like you would hope to see in sort of a corporate governance board, is number one, setting vision for what we can be. But number two is ensuring that our department has a strategic plan. And as importantly as having it, that board is responsible for holding our department accountable to that strategic plan. And so those things are all in the works as we speak. The next piece of the bill, again, sounds really inside baseball, but speaking about that, the government regulations and the responding at the speed of business. The bill allowed our department to be exempted out of state procurement and state Office of Technology Systems rules, and allows us to procure our own rules, or promulgate rather, our own rules for those processes. And that sounds irrelevant, but I'll give you a great example. We were looking for a contractor. You know, part of our work is small business work, and one of the services that we provide through training and education is that we hire professionals who will go train small businesses in their work. So, for example, we'll hire CPAs who will go teach classes for small business accounting for small businesses in workshops around the state. We had an RFP that trying to hire those accountants to go teach the class to our small businesses who don't have the luxury of paying for or hiring that themselves. That RFP sat in our state Office of Procurement for 9 months. So the ability of us as a department to be able to respond at the speed of business is going to be an incredibly important tool to our work. Same with technology services. It sounds small, but being encumbered by the state's computer system actually slows us down, and it's problematic, and I won't dwell on it, but this bill gives us the flexibility to operate outside of that. So that were some of the things that the bill did. But before the bill was passed, on day one, when I went into our organization, we started an internal restructure. We knew we had to change the way the culture at the organization worked and how we were going to function. And so this is sort of the how. And this is a great graphic that you don't see right now. But the acronym is AIM, right? And it's got an arrow and a target for this great graphic you're not looking at. And the A is align, the I is integrate, and the M is maximize. And that is the internal operating procedure for every single thing we now do at our department. When we have a project, when we have a conversation, when we have a communication, when we have a potential, when we have a problem, right? The first thing we do internally is when we assess the situation, we say, who do we need to align with about this? Who are the obvious partners, whether they're inside of state government or outside of state government? But who do we need to align with? So first we identify who we need to align with. Then we integrate with them. How can we integrate with them to work towards solving this problem, right? Maximizing this potential. And then the M is maximize. How do we maximize? I think maybe this has become because I come from the private sector. Maybe it's because I come from running a nonprofit, a foundation for the last 17 years. But maximizing everything we did was at the core of sort of how I've led for 17 years, and it just seemed pretty obvious to me inside of the State Department. So this AIM graphic is on everything you see inside the department. It's great and it's highly effective. So that's one piece of how we're doing things differently. But we really did structure all our internal departments as well, and I'm going to tell you sort of how we did that, and gosh, you could read it. So I'll tell you what they are first. Business development, completely different. Innovation, completely new. State economic competitiveness, new-ish, I'll explain. Strategic communications, and strategic communications usually involves visuals. Legislative affairs, finance and operations, private sector engagement, and Fast Start. So those are our internal departments. The leaders of each of those organizations report to me. Those are my only direct reports. That's how I manage our department. But those great leaders all manage a team of really great staff to the tune of about 200 people. So let me tell you some of the specifics around that. Our Office of Business Development. I've told this story often. Adam Knapp mistold it, and he very apologetically corrected himself to me after the fact because it led to some bad headlines last week. But so when I walked in on day one, I didn't know anybody at the department. I didn't know anybody. And so my deputy called a meeting. I said, could you call a meeting of my direct reports so I know, right, who they are and what they do? And so the first thing I did was I walked into a room that had almost as many people as that are in this room right now. There were 23 people, 20, maybe more, 27 people around a table who were direct reports to the secretary. So in the back of my mind, the first thing I said was, yeah, we're going to do that differently. The second thing is everyone went around the table and they described what they did at the department, what their role was. And they used a lot of government words, right? And so by the time it wrapped back around, I said, time out, appreciate everything, and you all sound like wonderful people. I just want to understand whose job is it, who here's job is to find leads, find projects, find companies, find opportunities to generate opportunity for Louisiana. Whose job is that? Raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand. So that's when I knew we had to do business development differently. We historically had an Office of Business Development that did not include any kind of lead generation. We had an Office of International Commerce whose job it was to actually do business development, but internationally. And then we had a department that was business expansion and retention, whose job it was to go talk to existing businesses and see if they wanted to stay. Different leaders, different staff, different plans, different activities, absolutely no integration. So all of that work now is all under the heading of our Office of Business Development with one leader who organizes and capitalizes on all of that talent and all of that work in that space. Huge transition. Number two, we had a small business department, which actually has a really good reputation. But there's a lot of financial components to our small business work that didn't have a very good reputation. SSBCI, it's a government acronym, it's federal money, small business support, something. But what you need to know is it's a $113 million program that the federal government is passing through, right? The feds are saying, here's federal money to Louisiana for you to get capital out to your small businesses in Louisiana. And our SSBCI program was struggling. We had a horrible reputation. We weren't using any technology or innovation in that space. So we completely revamped that work, and we now have an innovation vertical. And it is under the name of innovation, because if Louisiana is going to be different, not just catch up, right? I'm not interested in just catching up. If we're going to be different, if we're going to leapfrog our competitors, if we're going to change the narrative, if we're going to change our results, it is going to have to be done based on innovation. So we have an entire innovation vertical now, and all our small business work fits under that. Partnerships and engagement. So true story, the governor appointed me at Washington Mardi Gras. Nobody except me and a couple other people knew he was going to do that. So I went to Washington Mardi Gras as a private citizen, and 24 hours in, I was named Secretary of Economic Development. I had no staff with me, so I just walked around and I met people. And so the amount of people, from the time the governor announced me on Thursday of Washington Mardi Gras to I left on Friday evening, the amount of people who came up to me and handed me their business cards and said, Susan, I'm so-and-so, I own such and such, I'd really like to talk to you about X. Or, I have a friend who lives in Texas and he's interested in moving his business to Louisiana. And so I'm just taking these cards and I'm throwing them in my purse, shaking hands, just shaking hands and meeting all these wonderful people. So I get back to my hotel room and I clean out my purse, and there's really no shy of 200 business cards. And I thought, what in the world am I going to do with this, right? First of all, how am I going to follow up? I barely remember anybody that I met because I met them all at once, right? But more importantly, they all had value to add. They all made, these were real offers. This wasn't lip service. These were specifics. And so the very first decision I made was that we were going to formalize a process to make sure we took advantage of the expertise, the energy, and the willingness of our private sector, and we were going to use them to engage in and inform our work. So the first person I hired from the outside was somebody, her name is Rachel Shields, but she was the 25-year chief of staff to GNO Inc. And Rachel's sole role inside of our department is to create formal structures to make sure we are using the private sector of this state, the existing business community of this state, to inform and amplify our work. It hadn't been done, huge progress, and reputationally what this has done for us already is incredibly significant. We unified our marketing and communications under one, this is, again, you hear me say a lot, we have to change the narrative. Well, we had one department responding to the press and telling stories, and we had one department marketing the state, and those messages rarely overlapped. We are fundamentally changing that. If you hear anything from me today, and I think you've probably already heard it 10 times, changing the narrative is the single most important thing that we are going to do as a department. So back in the Moray days, there was a department within LED called State Economic Competitiveness. And it had really gone away since then. And the whole intention of this work is to research and continually be looking for opportunities to make changes big and small. Some of them can be tweaks, some of them can be constitutional amendments, and everything in between. But to make changes to what we do and how we do it to make us more competitive. At the end of the day, if one of the things we're trying to do is position Louisiana to win, we have to know what's positioning us poorly and what we can change to better position us. So we have created, we've moved around some incredibly talented staff that were already at the department, and we hired a new leader, and we have a new state economic competitiveness department. And what they're working on right now, just to tell you how timely it is, many of you I'm sure have heard that there's a conversation about either a special session, but if not a special, definitely this next regular session. We're looking at our tax code, right? Secretary Nelson has done a very deep dive, and if you've ever heard him present, you know how deep, into our tax code, how we can change it. But one of the things he talks about all the time is our incentives, right? Well, it's not Secretary Nelson's job to talk to the legislature about the return on investment on those incentives. It's ours. And so what that department is focused on in the very short term is looking at every one of the business incentives that Louisiana has as it relates to economic development and develop meaningful ROIs so we know ourselves, much less can go testify to the legislature about which one, where's the return for our dollar as a state, and which ones are we going to cling to and argue for as economic developers, right? And which ones maybe aren't working as well as we thought they were. So that's what they're working on right now. Finance and operations, right? That sounds boring, and here's the only thing I'll tell you about that. What the overwhelming message that I got early on in this job was that our incentives work, the people who follow up once a business gets an incentive with our department, did not have a customer service focus. We had a reputation for being a gotcha agency that was behaving like regulators, and we are neither. We are a customer service organization. And we are selling. When we succeed, when companies succeed, we succeed, right? Our job is to make it easier for businesses to expand, for businesses to locate, for industry to succeed here, because when they succeed, we succeed. So everything about our operations and finance work has changed to a customer service focus. And then lastly, Fast Start. For those of you who don't know, Fast Start is an award-winning, we were one for a long time, we're down to number 2, workforce investment day 1 program where we use it as an incentive to attract companies here. It's a remarkable program, but we had been one for a long time. We fell to number 2, and there were some challenges happening inside of our Fast Start. So we're repositioning Fast Start, and the new leader there has one goal. Well, she actually has 2 goals. I like to keep things real simple. Number 1 is integrate Fast Start into LED because we work as 2 completely separate departments. It makes no sense. It's not productive. So that's the inside baseball too. Number 2 is make us number 1 again, right? We were doing really well when Fast Start was considered number 1. So Chelsea's job is to make us number 1 again. So I want to tell you, so that's a lot of the how, right? So now I want to talk a little bit about the what. And I always try to be careful about this because, in my former life, I see the folks from Emergent here. I always said if I had a whole career to do over again, I would be like an organizational psychologist because I love that kind of stuff. I love structure. I love really digging into those pieces. And I have very high regard for effective strategic plans, which obviously I believe ours will be. But at the same time, I don't have the luxury of waiting until next January to tell me what we should be doing, right? So what I told our team early on is let's identify the things that we know, no matter what. The strategic plan is going to say you need to be working in this space. And we need to make sure we're still very much working in this space and identifying the opportunities in that space. So I'm going to tell you what I believe. If the slide was up, you would see what those 3 are. Number 1, and if it could be bold and highlighted and the font be bigger than everything else and it could be the only thing we talk about, this would be it. And it's energy. And it's not just because Louisiana is a traditional oil and gas state, which we are. My boss makes it clear every time he speaks, and he likes to make sure I make it clear every time we speak that we are an oil and gas state. We have been in the past. We absolutely believe we will be in the future. But the energy addition, everything that is coming, everything that the globe is demanding around energy, around environmental sensitivities to energy, around decarbonization, around renewables, right? Everything that is being, I call it, there's a global insistence. This is not a domestic policy that's going to change this very much, quite honestly. This is a global insistence on that work. And Louisiana is better positioned than any state in this country to take advantage of it. I'll tell you why. Well, this is a stat that I found fascinating. Goldman Sachs has already identified $3 trillion worth of energy addition investments that are going to happen between now and 2032. Oh, that's only 8 years. $3 trillion in 8 years are scheduled to be deployed in this space. Here's why Louisiana is ripe for that. Number 1, let's just talk carbon capture, right? I often tell the governor I should have been forced to go back and take a chemistry class before I took this job because so many of the processes and so many of the opportunities we have involve chemistry that I haven't had since high school. But if you look at decarbonization, and particularly carbon capture, and the opportunity we have in that space, you need 3 things to be successful in carbon capture. There are several places that have 2 of these 3. Louisiana is the only place that has these 3. We have 3 of the 3, and no one can catch up with this. Number 1 is that I call it rules, rocks, and movement, okay? Told you I like to oversimplify things. Number 1, rules. We have primacy, right? The EPA has given us the ability to permit our own wells for this work. So we make the rules, we can expedite permitting, we can do that. We are one of only 3 states that have primacy, right? So we can make our rules. Number 2 is the rocks. We happen to have the right rock formations under Louisiana land to make us ripe for this. And 3 is movement. You have to be able to get it from where it is to where you want to put it. And we have more pipelines running under our soil than any state in the country. So we have rocks, we have rules, and we have movement. Louisiana stands at the absolute forefront of opportunity in all things carbon capture. And our Department of Energy and Natural Resources is paying an immense amount of attention, making sure we get it right. Number 2 is our petrochemical history. You know, we are an industrial state. We have been for a long time. We have a workforce that's trained in it. We have a workforce, you know, this is my both number 2 and number 3 point here. We have a legacy workforce. I bet every one of you know people who work in a family where their mom or dad worked in the same industry, their mom and dad worked in the same industry. We have generational workforces. We have pride in our work. We wrap our culture into our work. We do it, we're loyal, we're committed. If I could brand and package our workforce, because every state has workforce challenges, that's not unique to Louisiana. If I could brand and package our workforce and just skin it for what it really is, other states would buy it from us. So energy, highlight, 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 right? Number 2, technology. All things technology, and most people would go, wait, this is Louisiana. Did Susan just say we have room in technology? We have a lot of room in technology, right? At the end of the day, we have 2 things that a lot of places don't have. We have land and we have grid capacity. Land and grid capacity gets a lot of attention. And it's not Bitcoin mining. It's not that kind of work. And it's, you know, people hear data centers and they don't understand what those are. They think that's a building with some computers in it. And, oh, they're buildings with some computers in them, for sure. But there was a great Wall Street Journal article last week that talked about just this data center space and how it is the perfect marriage of taking what had typically been blue-collar workers, upskilling them slightly into specific technology, and turning blue-collar folks who are used to working shifts and used to working with a screwdriver, and barely upskilling them into technology jobs. Those are data center jobs. They're very high paying, they're very important, they are in great demand, and the people who work in the space, I mean, there were sub-articles in this Wall Street Journal article about the workforce and how much they love the work. Louisiana has incredible opportunity in that space. And number 3, I'm a pragmatist at heart. Louisiana has always had a play in all kinds of defense work, right? I mean, Higgins Boat, you know, we can go back a long way. But truth be told, we have the Speaker of the House, we have the Majority Leader of the House, we have a powerful delegation beyond that, and the federal government drives defense spending. Louisiana has the ability to create an entire defense strategy around whatever our federal delegations suggest we should do, and that's exactly what we plan on doing. You know, referring back to that whole of government approach, I want our federal elected officials to help inform us as to what kinds of projects they think we are ripe for, what kinds of work they think we should be doing. So defense, you know, we're working on it now, and we know we will continue to work on it. I'm almost done. This is a great slide y'all are missing right now. It's got sort of this column. Looks a little bit like a historic thing. It's got 5 columns, right? But it's called the pillars, and this is about building a new foundation. And so, you know, I refer back to the mission at the beginning. That's just sort of bland and plain about creating economic development, you know, opportunities for everybody in Louisiana. I'm not sure that that means anything to anybody. So what I said early on as a leadership team is that we were going to develop pillars around what our work really means, and how we're going to develop measurements around these things, these pillars, so we can actually measure our work and measure our impact on Louisiana. And so here are our 5 pillars that run through everything we do. Number 1, we're going to continue to position Louisiana to compete and win. Number 2, we are going to ensure that every Louisiana citizen has the opportunity for proud and ever-growing wages. Number 3, we're going to create thriving regions today that are well positioned for the future. Number 4, we are going to optimize Louisiana's legacy industries to lead in the future just as they have done in the past. And number 5, we're going to drive Louisiana's small business ecosystem toward growth, innovation, and global impact. Those are the pillars that are informing our work. That's the new foundation at LED. That is the common thread in everything that we do. How do we do without pictures? Primarily, it was to discuss what we're changing at the Department of Economic Development from a structural perspective, but more importantly, what we hope we change the outcome to be, which is first and foremost changing the narrative about opportunity in Louisiana, and then secondly, driving real results for opportunity in Louisiana.
What kind of response have you seen so far?
You know, the response everywhere has been incredibly supportive and a lot of head nodding when I talk about it. Again, I think those of us in Louisiana who are from here or have been here a long time oftentimes just accept this narrative of less than or negativity without contradicting it or without questioning it. And so when I begin to tell the story of the economic opportunity Louisiana has, the opportunity a 16-year-old has to stay in Louisiana and work and make a meaningful wage and have a proud career, I think so much of it is just communicating that story. And so the reception's been great, but the actual sort of boots on the ground work of economic development, the projects are out there as well.
You made an announcement on a new national campaign. Tell us about that.
So we are launching a campaign this weekend called Come Home Louisiana, really aimed at those folks who grew up here, educated here, and now work someplace else, who want to consider coming home. We want to make sure they know they have an opportunity here, and we want to make sure businesses know that talent is able to attract back. And so we at LED feel like we have a role in putting those two pieces together.
What benefits will that have?
Well, the hope is to do exactly what I just said. Number one is that we need to fill those job openings of companies who have those mid-level, mid-career kinds of places that are, or openings that they need to recruit people for. We want to help with that, but we also want to bring some of our Louisiana talent back, right? People know they miss the culture. They know they miss their families. What they don't know, and what we plan on telling them, is what their economic opportunity is here.
You talked about changing the narrative. Explain what that means for people that may not be familiar with it.
Sure. So, again, we're all used to sort of listening to this story of, oh, Louisiana can't do this, or Louisiana's no good at that. And, I'm a realist. I'm not saying that we don't have our challenges, but every state has its challenges. And if you really look at our individual opportunities and our individual outcomes from parish to parish, and we start addressing them on a parish by parish level and telling the story differently, right? Instead of just having it be the stories of what perhaps we're not doing best, and telling more of the stories of success here, of businesses that are thriving, of career-driven individuals who are making wonderful careers here, of the value, of the affordability of living here. That story is there to be told, and so LED is taking on part of the responsibility for telling it.